So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the installation of the second Oliver Lee McCabe III, Ph.D., professor in the Neuropsychopharmacology of consciousness. Now, my name is Jimmy Potash. I'm the Henry Phipps Professor and Director of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. It's wonderful to see all of you here today, and it's a privilege to welcome Judy Shee, who made this professorship possible, and our honoree and her husband, Lee McCabe. I'm also pleased to extend a warm welcome to the second recipient of the professorship, Dr. Fred Barrett, and his wife, Sarah Barrett. And it's great to have so many family members and friends and colleagues of Dr. Barrett here to share in this special day with us. Welcome to you all. So I want to start by introducing our honoree, Dr. Lee McCabe, for whom the professorship is named. Dr. McCabe's a wonderful man. He's a remarkably fitting person to be honored in this way. On the one hand, he's played important roles in our department, having been on our faculty twice in very different capacities. He, 1979 to 81, as I was graduating high school, he was an assistant professor in our division of behavioral biology. He can take it. Then after 14 years of success in different realms involving mental health entrepreneurship and finance and management, he returned to spend 12 more years as a faculty member in a very significant leadership role in the department as director of the Office of Behavioral Health Care. But in addition to his accomplishments in our department, Lee's had a prominent place in the history of the field of psychedelic treatment in psychiatry. In the late 60s, he trained with Charles Savage, who had earlier, all the way back in 1952, published the first paper on the use of LSD to treat depression. In the early 70s, Drs. McCabe and Savage published a major study, a controlled study showing the effectiveness of LSD in the treatment of heroin addiction. And that pioneering work provides some of the motivation for a study going on, a project going on right now, in which center faculty member Dr. Sandy Nyack is working to determine whether psilocybin has comparable effectiveness in the treatment of opioid use disorder. I feel really lucky to have someone with Dr. McCabe's wisdom and experience still deeply engaged with our department. And I also feel lucky to have gotten to know Lee well over these last few years. He's someone who's got the passion and the persistence that I think of as hallmarks of Hopkins people. He cares about making a difference for patients and for the field. Let's all warmly welcome Dr. Lee McCabe to the podium.
Thank you, Jimmy. And welcome, everyone, to this very special day to honor Dr. Fred Barrett. I'm designated the honoree, but we know why we're here, right? As Jimmy mentioned, this day wouldn't be possible if it weren't for my wife, Judy Shee, who has had an abiding interest in psychedelic drug research for over 30 years. Since when I first told her about my work 20 years earlier. And since then, she's been intrigued by it, and now we're here because she has committed to the field in a very substantial way, in a number of different ways, and is really dedicated to the notion of personal development and improvement and societal growth, possibly with these compounds. And whether or not that happens, of course, is going to be determined by research, hopefully. We don't know a lot about how the psychedelics work. And Judy has honored me by naming this professorship And by trying to link my past work with the wonderful work that was led by the prolific and beloved Roland Griffiths. And now we have a chance today to honor Dr. Barrett, who will be accepting the transfer of a torch of leadership. The work we did at Spring Grove State Hospital and the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center was all federally sponsored research, and it was with a range of patients, alcoholics, as Jimmy said, opiate users, terminal cancer patients, and I started there actually as a bachelor's degree graduate, stayed there through my master's and Ph.D., earning that, and my Ph.D. dissertation was actually a clinical trial with Spring Grove, non-psychotic Spring Grove patients with severe psychoneurosis. Yes, that was the nomenclature back then. And no, Fred, I didn't write my dissertation with a quill. Dr. Potash will be listing the qualifications of Fred for this honor, and Judy will be also saying some nice things about him. So I'll say just that Fred has the goods, and the only thing I think he needs to worry about is maybe some things not necessarily under his control, but I see the challenges as being both scientific and societal. If some of you know that our program ended because of just a critical mass of societal, regulatory, political things coming together that made it all end. And on the scientific side, I have some pet questions. Would you like to hear what I'd like you to focus? Besides the brain stuff, which is your wheelhouse, I think it would be great to unpack the intervention, especially trying to determine the relative effects of drug and extra drug variables, and you're probably already working on that. Also, to continue to move from efficacy to effectiveness studies, especially if doing longitudinal work where we begin to get a sense of the natural history of the treatment with different patient cohorts. But, I think the real challenge, though, will be societal. And I think it will come from the ever-present recreational and personal user who will get into trouble, and something will happen that will end up in the media, and there'll be a tendency for your program to be stigmatized. The public has a tough time distinguishing between set and setting issues and the importance of that, and just the use of drugs in an open sense. And in the open use of drugs, you don't know what other drugs are being used, what the exact setting is, and that kind of thing. So there'll be that source of problems. There'll also be problems, I think, with some of the people who are being trained to be facilitators. And I don't know exactly what that training is like, but it seems like the educational requirements are rather modest. And the likelihood of everyone being able to handle intra-session difficulties is low. And the skill in determining which patients should not be treated at all, because some subjects just aren't good candidates for this kind of therapy. But anyway, those are my my thoughts, and I congratulate you, Fred, for being in this position today, and I wish you luck.
Thanks, Lee, for those very, very thoughtful remarks. I think they do make clear how fortunate we are to have you as the honoree of this professorship. I want to now turn to the other half of this dynamic duo, Dr. Judy Shi, donor of the endowed chair. Like Lee, Dr. Shi has deep roots in our department, also having had 2 stints with us. She was a therapist in our child and adolescent division in the late 80s, and then returned 5 years later to do work both in geriatric psychiatry and the Office of Behavioral Health Care. Judy would go on to get a Ph.D. focused on health policy, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC, which actually hadn't thought of. It's right immediately adjacent to Spring Grove Hospital, where the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center is. Coincidence? I don't know. That her skill set spans child to geriatrics and clinical practice to policy only begins to capture the breadth of her interests. Judy is truly a Renaissance woman with curiosity about and talents in many areas: art, music, poetry, spirituality. We're really lucky to have had her come forward in 2018 with an interest in establishing the first endowed chair, first endowed fund for our psychedelic work here at Hopkins. And I think she established what is the first endowed professorship in the country and probably the world in psychedelic work. That conversation started about a year before the center got established. And so together with the funding for the center and its creation, her gift constituted a really impactful endorsement of the work that Roland Griffiths, the first recipient of this professorship, had done over nearly 20 years. In the time since then, Julie's been a delightful friend and wise counselor to us. She's served as co-chair of our department's advisory board, helped us think through several new strategic initiatives. So Judy, I want to thank you again for your tremendous generosity and for your dedication to our mission and for your ongoing partnership with us. Let's all give Dr. Judy Shi, the creator of this professorship, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Potash, for your kind introduction. And good afternoon, faculty, staff, family, and friends. I'm really happy to be here today to celebrate the second recipient of the McCabe Professorship, Dr. Fred Barrett. When someone lays a solid foundation, those that follow can build confidently on that foundation. And we were so honored to have had Dr. Roland Griffith lay that foundation and to have Dr. Fred Barrett continue with that building. I've come to see that while an endowed professorship gives a permanence of name, it achieves its sense of the everlasting through the living dynamism of the contribution of the successive generations of people that follows. And I want to thank Dr. Barrett for continuing that legacy. When they ask how someone gets selected for such a position, here at Hopkins, nothing is handed down to you. You earn it. I think everyone who has known Dr. Barrett will know that he is eminently qualified and extraordinarily hardworking. I remember when Dr. Griffith first introduced us to the research team at the BPRU. And this was just before the formation of the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research in the winter of 2019. And I recall that we met Dr. Barrett, and may I call you Fred, and you shared with me, with us, your love for music and neuropsych research. And I could see he was so enthusiastic and passionate about his work. And he had a deep sensitivity and compassion for people. And I could tell that he had a pride in working for Hopkins, an institution that leads in research and patient care. We have gotten to know Fred over the past 5 years, and how wonderful to know that our research, our science, is in the hand of the next generation that includes someone like Fred. At work, he is bright and hardworking, dedicated and responsible. As a person, he is warm and caring, sincere and humble, giving and engaged in his community. As a parent, he and his wife, Sarah, are deeply caring and protective of their children, recognizing and attending to their individual needs, at the same time fostering their independence, unique talents, and curiosity. If I was Fred's parent, I would feel so proud to have a son whose character reflects a genuine goodness and honesty. I feel blessed to be able to call Fred a friend, and I always look to our sharing at our book club and to learning from you. I feel confident that the center is under the leadership of a man who will uphold and champion for ethical and rigorous research standards, and which is the hallmark of Hopkins. I'm so glad to share this special moment with you and with your friend, with your colleagues, with your family. In many ways, it is easy for me to give this professorship. It is much harder to receive. And I know that Fred knows and recognizes the responsibilities that are on his shoulder. I also know that he is one of the best of us. And I cannot think of a more deserving and qualified person to carry forth the research in the neuropsychopharmacology of consciousness. Thank you, Fred, for your dedication, courage, and hard work. I'm really grateful for you. Thank you.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you, Judy. I want to now call up Dr. Eric Strain, who will introduce the recipient of the McCabe Professorship, Dr. Fred Barrett. Dr. Strain is the George Bigelow Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and he's the director of the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit.
0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds.
Uh-oh. That means our time is up. All right, time to go. Eric's the head of the BPRU, which is one of the leading clinical substance use research programs in the country. I'm very proud of that, and I tell all of our residency applicants that every time I meet with them. But that is also the place out of which the Psychedelic Center was born, and Fred's spent many years within the BPRU, and Eric played an important role in mentoring Fred since Fred's arrival 11 years ago. So, Eric, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jimmy. Can people hear me okay in the back? Yeah, good. This is a tribute to the recipient, this is titled. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to make a few remarks about Dr. Frederick Streeter Barrett. I'm going to come back to Streeter. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge Lee McCabe and Judy Shee. I've known Lee from his earlier days in the department, and reconnecting with him and getting to know Judy as well has been a particular delight for me. And thank you, Lee and Judy, for making all this possible. So back to Fred. I want to begin by noting I've been asked to give a tribute to Fred. And I initially assumed that by tribute, it was meant that I was to give a few words conveying respect and admiration of Fred. A laudatory speech, perhaps with some trumpets or cornets in the background. And then the more I because that's a common way we generally think of tributes, right? But then I realized there's also a second definition, which is, and I quote from that esteemed source, Google, a tribute is a payment made periodically. Tribute is a payment, like money. And then I realized that this invitation did come from development. So I'm going to assume this is the laudatory type of tribute, but I'm keeping my hand on my wallet for the rest of the evening. As I reflect on the laudatory words about Frederick Streeter, Barrett, I'm not going to focus on his educational history, his productivity, his seminal papers. I'd rather spend a minute or two commenting on his qualities as a person. Yeah, looks a little nervous. I think these qualities reflect not just his temperament, but his character. And Judy, it was interesting to hear you just reflect on character. While temperamental qualities can derive from our parents and be hard to shake, the way my mother fretted as she grew older, and now I seem to fret just a little bit. Character qualities are learned and reflect how the person has been shaped by circumstances, influences on their life, and their own decisions on how they desire to live their values and to treat others. I will touch on Fred's qualities, but I think that it is his character, how he lives his values, that I particularly want to highlight here, and I appreciate. So Fred has admirable qualities. As a scientist, he has deep content knowledge, rigor to his thinking, creativity in his approaches, and enthusiasm and delight in his work. He gets excited about his research and has an infectious ability to convey that to others. I recall him once excitedly getting me in his office, showing me results of colostrum functioning related to the acute effects of psilocybin. I was holding on by my fingertips to understand it, but I left with the glow of his enthusiasm and more knowledge, and I appreciate that. But his qualities at a personal level are what I want to especially note. If you know Fred, you know of his commitment to his family, his wife Sarah, his children, son Zach, and his daughter Lillian, as well as his more extended family, which I've heard about over the years. I think the only thing that gets Fred more excited than talking about science is talking about his family. If you don't know Sarah, Zach, and Lillian, he loves to talk about them and clearly delights in them. His commitment to his family speaks to his character. Fred also has a variety of outside interests. An old boat he's been rehabilitating. I think he finished finally. No, he didn't. Brewing beer, his love of music, his work with the Scouts has become a true passion. I expect him to show up at work some Monday morning wearing a Scout uniform and smelling of smoke from a weekend of camping. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention his love of puns. Oh, some of you know this. Too many of us have been subjected to this punishment. Having been Barretted by him for not laughing at one of his puns. I don't think I've ever met with Fred and not laughed at some point in the conversation. Okay, so to wrap up. Maya Angelou famously said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I leave talking with Fred feeling good. Energized, humored, more knowledgeable. He demonstrates admirable qualities of character. I might just give him a tangible tribute to go along with this trumpeting of horns and this verbal tribute. As long as development doesn't start asking me for more tributes. That is a street. A streeter? I'm not going to go down. Thank you.
Of course, I have to say that was very punny. For a behaviorally oriented psychiatrist, there were some pretty powerful insights that you had there. Wow, no, that was wonderful, Eric. Gosh, a lot of nice things have been said about Fred. I think I need to say just a couple more before we bring Fred up. I've had the pleasure of mentoring Fred since he assumed the role of center director a couple of years ago, a year or two ago now, and also gotten a chance to get to get to know him well through that and through this same book club that Judy alluded to. And Fred's done nothing but impress me these last couple of years. Tremendous energy with a really lightning quick mind that kind of astonishes me at times, and creativity and a desire to do things the right way and to give credit to others, to take great care of his faculty and his fellows and his staff members. And I admire the fact that he recognizes that the contributions of every person on the team are important and make a difference. I really couldn't be more pleased that Fred is the person succeeding Roland Griffiths, both as center director and as the McCabe professor. Let's give a warm welcome to our recipient, Dr. Fred Barrett.
It's hard to hear nice things said about you, and that's really strange. And I'm even that much more grateful. Thank you, Dr. Potash, Dr. Strain, especially Drs. Shi and McCabe. I want to thank you all who are here. I know each and every one of you, some very, very well and very deeply, and I'm grateful for all of you for being here today. And I also need to express, the deepest gratitude for my wife, Sarah, as she rolls her eyes at me, and my mother, Mary, and my brother-in-law, Andrew. It's been absolutely critical and amazing how much they've supported me over the past few years through thick and thin, and none of this I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for all of them. So thank you. I wasn't sure if starting such remarks with a quote from Shakespeare would be appropriate or tired or pedestrian, but here we go. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. Romeo, doff thy name, and for that name which is no part of thee take all myself. Juliet may have been arguing the case that a name of a thing should not define what that thing really is, yet names obviously carry meaning. They're imbued with assertions and assumptions, and like the names Romeo and Juliet, they embody sometimes an inordinate, almost magical weight of sociocultural and historical legacy that seems to extend well beyond their mere sound. I'm honored beyond words to hold the title with the names Oliver Lee McCabe III, Professorship in the Neuropsychopharmacology of Consciousness. But if you'll bear with me for a moment, I want to break those names and words down. I've had the distinct privilege of getting to know Judy and Lee over the past few years. And by all accounts, Lee is a remarkable man. You've already heard some of the amazing accomplishments that he's had. I'll start with father, Olympian, karate master, therapist, businessman, and scientist. You've heard about Lee's connection to Hopkins, to the Maryland Psychiatric Institute, and also, his in his early career working as the chief of addiction research at the Maryland Psychiatric Institute and publishing one of the most rigorous LSD clinical trials of that time period. The study was published at the end of many years of study in our society that began in the 50s. And all of that interest in LSD and other psychedelics sparked a movement that embodied just as much turmoil as it did promise. It's not lost on me that we're in the midst of a wave of college protests against the war, while at the same time voices of reason and empirical and medical science are battling against voices of both overpromise and fear-mongering of psychedelic medicines. I don't want to say that we're living and reliving the 60s and 70s, far from it, but I do hope that enough of us have learned enough of the lessons of the past, at least enough to allow reason and truth to prevail. Lee was, of course, a very careful pioneer of the field 50 years ago, and it's a great honor to sit in a chair with his name at a time that we so desperately need the balance of rigor and caution, as well as a clear understanding of the power and the potential of these compounds that is embodied in Lee's work. So what is in a name? I think there's much to aspire to in the name of Lee McCabe, and he sets a profoundly appropriate example for the work that we need to accomplish going forward and the manner in which we should approach it. So, in the name of Oliver Lee McCabe, the third Ph.D. professor in the Neuropsychopharmacology of consciousness, what then comes of neuropsychopharmacology? Well, I never planned or aspired to be a neuropsychopharmacologist, but that's where my curiosity led me. I began my career as a music educator, but before graduating from undergrad, had added a degree in psychology and a minor in cognitive neuroscience. By the time I entered graduate school, I came to understand music as a powerful tool to help understand the neuropsychology of emotions and memories. What a remarkable tool. Almost all of us use music every day to implicitly or explicitly regulate our emotions and our memories. So why not use that tool for science? We're going to use that tool for good. And through grad school, I learned how complicated music is, because we all have these idiosyncratic things called preferences and memories that make music a challenging tool for a careful scientist. And about the same time as I was really becoming frustrated with that, I was offered the chance to come to Hopkins to complete a postdoctoral fellowship in psychedelics with Roland Griffiths. And of course, music is complicated because people are complicated, but drugs, we should, all sorts of things about drugs, right? How they work in the brain, how people go about using them. Turns out that drugs are complicated because people are complicated, and a lot of people in this room also know that. But along the way, I think we and I have been able to do some good science here. I've published a number of first-in-human studies in the area. I was the first to show the emotional profile of music-evoked nostalgia, the fact that music-evoked nostalgia can recruit striatal reward as well as memory regions while you're experiencing nostalgia. I was the first to show that a single high dose of psilocybin has a positive and lasting effect on the healthy brain for at least a month afterwards. The first-in-human research on the claustrum, not colostrum. I need to make that clear sometimes in talks because people get very confused. And a number of other firsts that I think are really setting the foundation of some really solid insights. And if I can just manage to publish a paper on sex differences in the brain, then I can fulfill my ignoble career goal of saying that I study sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But so far, drugs and rock and roll and some fancy imaging have been powerful tools. And sometimes people ask me, how did I get involved in this? And it's really through altered states of consciousness. The altered states of consciousness that I encountered as a musician on stage, playing with a really tight ensemble, whether it was a punk rock band or a chamber orchestra or a salsa merengue band. These really led me to really deeply be curious about the mind and how we can study it. And really just acknowledging that not only can music be a powerful effector of consciousness, so can endogenous and exogenous drugs. We can continue to use music and drugs as powerful tools to understand these things, but we, after talking about it for long enough, can't get away from that tricky C word. So coming to this word consciousness, what is consciousness and how do you study it? When we were trying to decide upon the name of what became the first psychedelic research center in the world and the largest, first in the country and the largest in the world, Roland Griffiths suggested we use the word consciousness in the title. Every other faculty member in the center and every postdoc objected, some strongly, on the basis that the name itself was elusive and the study of the thing that it pointed to was even more elusive. One of the positions is that we can't study consciousness directly. But we can study the contents of consciousness. And if we're studying the contents of consciousness, well, so is every other psychologist, neuroscientist, and psychiatrist around the world. So what's special about that? And if we can't actually directly study the contents of consciousness or consciousness itself, then why are we claiming to do so? This point was held strongly enough that David Yaden and I, along with all the faculty of the center and a few colleagues, later co-authored a paper explaining in fine detail our position and calling, I quote, for epistemic humility regarding the potential of psychedelic research to aid in explaining the hard problem of consciousness. And so when we were planning the center, Roland heard each of our concerns carefully. He nodded knowingly and said, I hear you, and you raise good points. And of course, that resulted in the center becoming the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Because once Roland was convinced of an idea, you could not dissuade him. For some of us, Roland would rationalize this as a name that excited and inspired philanthropists and future funders. For others, he would admit that he thought that it captured the mystery of the field and the mystery of the compounds that we were studying, and isn't that neat? But also, ultimately, I think the name also captures an aspiration that he had, that I think we all still do have, that there's something truly remarkable and fundamentally scientifically revolutionary about these compounds. And to bring it home, Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, wrote that paradigms are not corrigible by normal science at all. Instead, as you would see if you read his book, and I encourage you to do so, normal science ultimately leads only to the recognition of anomalies and crises. Kuhn, in his book, argued that science doesn't really always progress in straight lines. It may plod along in a linear fashion, in a stepwise fashion, maybe a slow arc. But the real discoveries come at sharp turns, sometimes 90-degree angles, and abrupt departures from what had become the status quo, or the canon in the field, or the momentum or maybe inertia of the field, right? So this C word, I think, points in that direction and points in the direction the psychedelics may take us. In his book, Kuhn also wrote, "To know what you know and what you do not know, that is true knowledge." I think we know that we're not quite there yet. But gifts such as this endowed chair really ensure the stability and protection needed to take careful, calculated risks, to support projects that might otherwise be a bit challenging to get traditional funding for, to provide support to train the next generation of scientists and clinicians, and to really dig in our heels and advance into the unknown, and maybe eventually lead us to even deeper and more impactful discoveries. So I'll close by saying it's an honor and a privilege to work at the cutting edge of knowledge and discovery at one of the top academic medical institutions in the world, and to receive one of the highest honors available to an academic at such an institution, and to hold such specific and meaningful title with the weight, responsibility, and promise of the Oliver Lee McCabe III Professorship in the Neuropsychopharmacology of Consciousness. A chair by any other name would not smell as sweet. Thank you.
Wow, what a tour de force. Oh my goodness, that was magnificent. I applaud the choice of Shakespeare as a former English major. Love it, absolutely love it. And I like the idea of you writing your book eventually, Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, a memoir of the McCabe professor. I don't know if that would need the approval of the honoree or not. Wow. It's a little bit of a shame that we have to come to an end, but I want to thank each of you for joining us today. So glad you could be here. I want to thank Mike DeVito, who brought everything together and without whom we would not have been able to make this happen. And now I want to invite you to continue the celebration with the reception outside. Thanks, everybody.